Hi creative friends, this is Joy. So these are the last of the squares that I saved and held back from when I was creating specimen cards. These were the squares that were die cut from the centers of those, and so I decided that I was going to use them for some cards. And here I prearranged and selected how I wanted to lay them out, and I decided to do two of them on a black card base and three of them on a craft card base. So here I'm just taking and gluing them down, and this is going to be my background on these cards for creating these cards out of these pieces of scrap. And I'm just using Bearly Arts glue is what I'm using to glue this down. And the card bases I've had my stash for a long time. And I actually ended up getting a bunch of different card bases from craft sales. So that was, has really helped. So yeah, here I'm just gluing all the squares down onto the card bases. And it's, good to use a liquid glue on these craft card bases because it's it doesn't take easily to having stuff glued to them or stuck to them. So the wet glue is probably the best to use on craft when you're trying to glue stuff down to craft paper here. So yeah, I hope that you had was able to watch my previous videos on all the different fodder and ephemera I was able to make out of scraps. So there you go, that's all the card bases now. And so I pulled a couple of different stamp sets out of my stash to use that I thought would, work well with these cards. And so I got this floral stamp set that I decided would look cute on as a center point or a focal point on some of the cards. And so I'm just inking it up, and I decided to stamp it multiple times because I can always put the extra stamp images in my stash to use later on. So I always like to do extra. And here I have a little foam piece of packaging underneath that helps me to get a better stamped image, and it was a little off on that top left one. It kind of didn't stamp on that side, but oh well. And it didn't stamp, that great on all of them, but I not that great of a stamper. And I just use a black pen to fix any areas where maybe it didn't stamp as well. So I'm going through a stash of different shapes. I one day just spent a day doing a bunch of die cutting shapes, and putting them in this pouch so that I can use them for whatever projects, various projects. And so I'm going through, looking at the different shapes and deciding, I think on a couple of these cards I want to use a couple of shapes instead of doing them all just the same. And so I decide on these two shapes. And I'm going to use this stamp set. And so I put that on stamp on a block, and it's of some flowers. And I take a piece of tape, and I decide didn't want it to go all the way off the edge. And so I cut a piece of tape and I put it along the bottom edge, just so when I stamp it, it'll still have a little bit of a white edge on the bottom. And so I ink that up, and then stamp it on one side. And you can see where there's a little bit of a white border on the bottom. And then on the other one, since it's a kind of a flower shape, it's a little bit harder to do that with. I just went ahead and stamped it on there without being too concerned that it ran off the bottom of the page. So to clean my stamps, I just use alcohol, and I use these paper towels that are actually meant for, like, you know, a shop. They're shop towels. I like them better because they don't leave lint and stuff on my stamps. And so I've got this dragonfly that I decided, well, I thought I was going to use it, but you'll see in the end I don't end up using the dragonfly, and I get a scrap piece of cardstock that I had rather than cutting up and using a whole piece, and so I stamped the dragonfly on that. And then I have a punch, and again I just spray it with alcohol and then wipe it off with the shop towel. And I have a punch that'll punch out that dragonfly. And actually the punch and doesn't punch out the big dragonfly itself. It also punches out a smaller dragonfly, and I ended up using the smaller one. But I still left this in here to kind of show you what I did with the bigger dragonflies. Even though I don't use them, I figured I'll save them for another project. So I cut these apart, and then here's the punch. And I just slide it in there, line it up, and then punch it out. And it gives me a little one, and then it punches out the big one that I just stamped. And the little one wasn't what I was going for. I was just wanting to punch out the big ones. But in the end, I ended up using the little ones because the big ones seemed like they were just not the, you know, just too oversized for what I was, you know, wanting to use it for. So then I get out my markers and proceeded to color the images, the stamped images that I have. So on the flowers, I basically just took I wanted them to be red, just took a lighter red color and colored the flower in to kind of put a base of color down. And here I decided to cut them apart because I figured it'd just be easier to cut them apart. And I end up coloring a couple of these and then putting the rest of them in my stash for other projects. And here I take a black pen because on this one here it stamped pretty good, but there was a couple places that need to be fixed. And so yeah, I just go through and put a base of the lighter color down. And I definitely don't consider myself a great colorer with markers. I'm actually quite, you know, new at using and coloring with markers, but I managed to get the job done good enough, I guess. And then I take a darker color, a darker red, and then I go around, and I was trying to clean up where I went over the edge a little bit with the blending pen. If you get it before it dries, and you can usually, you know, push it back in. And so then I get a darker red and I go around where the shadow would be on these petals. And I could have used a third color, but I think I just used 2 colors. Again, I'm not really that you know, big of a coloring marker person, but like I said, I guess I do good enough. And then I use a yellow, a lighter yellow in the middle, and then come back with a darker and just kind of go around and give it some variety in the middle. And then I do the little flower buds the same. I use the lighter color. And then I come back with the darker and just add any darker shadowing areas. And then I do the same with the leaves. I do the lighter for all the leaves and the ferns. And then I come back with a darker and do more darker on different areas where it would be shadowing, where there would be a shadow, or like on the veins. So that's pretty much how I ended up coloring all of the flowers. And here I'm going back over with the lighter color to kind of blend it out a little bit. And then for these stamped images, I just, very simple, yellow on the centers, green for the leaves, the leaves, and then here just a little bit of a cream color for the petals for shadowing. So just do really simple for these particular stamped images. I decided to use 2 different greens. A lighter green for the leaves on the flowers, and then a darker green for the foliage in the back. Just to give a little bit of variety to the image. And then I did some little grasses along the bottom. On the dragonfly, I went with a very light blue-gray, trying to find the lightest one. And I color the wings. With that, and then I take a darker gray for the head and the body. And then a black to like add eyes and markings on the body. And then I decided to get some stickles out and put it on the wings to make the wings sparkly. So I really like the way the little dragonflies turned out. They were so cute. I'm Wish I could have used them on these cards, but they just didn't seem like it went with anything. So to cut out the flowers, I just did a quick cut around it, and I did leave a little bit of a border of white instead of trying to cut it so closely. And then once I got so far to where the excess was getting in my way, I would just, chop it off. And to go around the ferns, I just kind of went around them and didn't, you know, try to get in between the leaves at this point. It's just easier for me just to go ahead and cut around the whole image as best I can. And again, whenever the excess starts getting into my way, I just chop it off and then keep going. And then once I've completely, cut around the image, then I'll go back through and cut off any excess, like on the fern and between the leaves and that kind of thing. So anywhere where there's any bit of excess white paper, I'll go ahead and trim that up. And so that's what I'm doing here, going in between the leaves of the fern. And trimming some of that up. So that's pretty much what I got. So here you see where I've decided on what cards I'm going to put those on. And that's the little dragonflies that I decided to color the same as I did the big ones, but decided the little ones were better, be better to use. And I use foam tape on the backs to pop these up on the card. And I have a bunch of shapes where I just stamped a bunch of different happy birthdays on them, because I do a lot of happy birthday cards. And so I just went one day and took a bunch of shapes and just stamped happy birthday from a bunch of different stamp sets. So I just went in that stash, pulled out some of them I thought would go with the cards, and decided to add those to these cards. So that's what you see me doing here. I picked out which ones I wanted on which cards. And the bottom left one, I did ink around it with a little bit of red. I thought I might like that, but I was like, I don't think I want to do that to the rest of them. And then I have gems that I decided to use on the cards as well. So I'm adding some gems to the cards. And I got out some stickles because I wanted to add, since the two top ones on the top left have stickles on the wings, I wanted to add something to these flowers, so I decided to put some gold stickles on the center of the big flower, just to kind of give it a little bit of sparkle and shine. So that's pretty much how I finished those off. And for these, I glue down the little butterfly, or the little dragonfly that I colored and stickled and created. I put foam tape on the back so that it gets popped up on the back of the card, or on the front of the card. Put that down on the center, and I add it to my sentiment as well. And add the sentiment on the bottom. And then I add my gems to the cards. To this card, I add some green gems that I thought would go well with this card. and decided to add a couple of more down on the happy birthday sentiment. They always say to add odd numbers. I don't know. So here's all the cards I made. They're all dried and done. So I thank you for stopping by watching, and I hope you like this little series of using up your scraps. And we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.